This lecture is on the brain and cranial nerves. How does the brain develop? Neurulation is the development of the nervous system from ectoderm. The ectoderm folds together to form a hollow cylinder called the neural tube. In this illustration, we see the ectoderm in blue. This is an embryonic tissue layer that forms the skin and nervous tissue. Here we see the ectoderm folding to form the hollow cylinder called the neural tube. The neural tube will become the brain and spinal cord. Cells along the neural tube, called neural crest cells, will become the peripheral nerves. And the peripheral nerves will extend into the body of the developing embryo. Neural tube formation depends on adequate intake of folic acid and B12. Spina bifida can occur if the mother has inadequate nutrition, either prior to or during pregnancy. Thus, women of reproductive years should consider a multivitamin with 400 micrograms of folic acid along with B12. Most processed foods are fortified with these vitamins as well. Here we see the three kinds of spina bifida. There's spina bifida occulta, and then there's spina bifida with the meninges seal, where the meninges have herniated out through the vertebral column, and then myelomeningocele. Myelo means the spinal cord, and then meningo is the meninges, so both the spinal cord and the meninges have herniated out of the vertebral column. Seal means the hernia. By the 13th week of embryonic development, the four major regions of the brain are apparent. The cerebrum, shown in blue, the diencephalon in purple, the brainstem, which includes the midbrain in yellow, the medulla oblongata and pons in a darker purple, and then the cerebellum in red. So by 13 weeks, all four regions are apparent, and by birth, they resemble the adult brain. Let's look at the gross anatomy of the brain. The brain is composed of gray matter and white matter tissue. Gray matter tissue functions in integration, which is information processing, and consists of neuronal cell bodies, dendrites, and unmyelinated axons. There are two major regions of gray matter tissue: the cortex, which is the superficial layer of gray matter, illustrated here, and nuclei, which are regions of gray matter, clusters of cell bodies, within the brain. White matter tissue functions in information transfer and consists of myelinated axons and oligodendrocytes. Tracts are deeper within the brain, pictured here. They're in a cream color, and they're organized into bundles that have the same function as nerves in the peripheral nervous system. So there are tracts that will connect the same hemispheres of the brain, and then there's a special group of fibers in a tract called the corpus callosum, which connects the two hemispheres of the brain. Cranial meninges are layers of connective tissue that protect and nourish the brain. They are continuous with the spinal meninges and will be discussed in the next few chapters. There are three layers of meninges: the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. The dura mater is a two-layered sheet of fibrous connective tissue. The two layers are fused together except where they drain blood from the brain. Therefore, they act like a vein and are called the venous sinus. The dura mater is like a thick leather sheath. This is similar to what we were seeing in the muscles and neurons when we looked at the epimysium for the muscles and the epineurium for the neurons. They're all very similar consistencies in their construction. The arachnoid mater is a web-like tissue filled with cerebrospinal fluid. The subarachnoid space contains cerebrospinal fluid and large blood vessels. The pia mater is a delicate areolar connective tissue that clings tightly to the brain, and it is richly invested with tiny blood vessels. So if you think about it, the arachnoid mater would be similar to the paramysium or the perineurium, right? That middle layer of connective tissue that protects organs, and the pia mater would be like the endomysium or the endoneurium, which is that inner delicate layer that is directly connected to the cells themselves. So that's a pretty common theme that we have seen when discussing these organs and their organization. This illustration shows the cranial meninges. We have the skin of the scalp and the layers of bone, and then deep to the bone is the dura mater. So 2 layers of a thick, tough, fibrous sheath that surrounds the brain and anchors the brain to the skull. Here's the venous sinus that will drain blood. Here's the inner layer, the deep layer of the dura mater, and it extends into the fissure that separates the 2 hemispheres of the brain. This is the subdural space, which is an important site for injuries because it can get filled with blood in a subdural hematoma. Deep to the subdural space is the arachnoid mater, and it is a thick sheath that has a web-like construction deep to it that can be filled with cerebrospinal fluid and large blood vessels. And the deepest layer is the pia mater, which directly contacts the neural tissue. A subdural hematoma can occur as a result from a traumatic blow to the skull. The blood collects between the dura and arachnoid mater, and pressure on the brain damages neurons, which, if left untreated, can lead to unconsciousness and death. And sometimes this is hard to pinpoint, particularly if the trauma was on the other side of the brain. But sometimes when the brain undergoes trauma, you have 2 sites of injury, the impact site and then the site across from it with the secondary impact as the brain was jostled and slammed into the other side of the skull. Thus, a CT scan is very important if head injury has been suspected. Meningitis is a severe infection of the meninges caused by a virus or bacteria. Swelling of the meninges causes complications in underlying neural tissue and can be fatal. Viral meningitis is the most common. Fortunately, it is usually mild and resolves itself. However, viral meningitis caused by the herpes virus can be fatal to infants. This is another reason you don't want people to touch and kiss your children when they're very, very young, because they may have a cold sore you don't know about, and it can be fatal to the infant. Bacterial meningitis can spread from meninges into the brain, resulting in death within days of onset. Vaccines can help prevent bacterial meningitis, and prompt medical treatment with antibiotics is required. Here are the signs of meningitis: fever, cold hands and feet, and this is in an infant, so refusing food and vomiting, being fretful, not liking being handled, drowsy, floppy, unresponsive, lethargic, rapid breathing or grunting, pale, blotchy skin with spots or rash, unusual cries or moans, a tense, bulging fontanelle from the pressure that is building up in their brain, a stiff neck, which is a symptom in adults as well, disliking bright light, and then if it's gotten pretty severe, convulsions and seizures. All right, so So the cerebral spinal fluid, abbreviated CSF, is a filter of the blood that is secreted by ependymal cells and capillaries located within the choroid plexus. Cerebral spinal fluid circulates throughout the ventricles, central canal of the spinal cord, and the arachnoid mater. Functions of cerebrospinal fluid include controls the chemical environment of the brain, keeping it stable, forms a liquid cushion and reduces the brain's weight by 97%, preventing delicate tissue from crushing under its own weight, and protects the brain as well as the spinal cord from blows and trauma. Here we see the cerebrospinal fluid. Number 1 illustrates the choroid plexus. The literature says in number 1, the cerebrospinal fluid is produced by the choroid plexus of each ventricle. So we see it in several places. In number 2, the cerebrospinal fluid flows through the ventricles and into the subarachnoid space. So we see the arrows showing the direction of our cerebrospinal fluid flowing. So then in step 3, it will flow through the subarachnoid space as well as through the central canal of the spinal cord. And in step 4, the cerebrospinal fluid will be absorbed into these venous sinuses that I showed you before that are formed from the 2 layers of the dura mater. The cerebrospinal fluid flows from the ventricles into the subarachnoid space, where it is reabsorbed into the bloodstream. Hydrocephalus occurs if the cerebrospinal fluid flow is obstructed or does not reabsorb into the bloodstream. This causes severe swelling and brain damage in infants. It can affect adults and be misdiagnosed as Alzheimer's. Treatment includes inserting shunts that drain the cerebrospinal fluid into the peritoneum of the abdominal cavity. In this illustration, we see normal cerebrospinal fluid draining into the bloodstream, or being absorbed into the bloodstream. In hydrocephalus, the cerebrospinal fluid builds up in the ventricles. There's blocked flow. And this is a picture of an infant with hydrocephalus. And the reason that their head can expand so large is that they still have the presence of fontanelles, which allow for the rapid brain growth that occurs during the first year of life. The blood-brain barrier, abbreviated BBB, is formed by astrocytes wrapped around specialized blood capillaries. We can see the astrocyte here. Remember, that is a star-shaped cell. It's a neuroglial cell in the central nervous system. And it has these feet called perivascular feet because they're around the vascular tissue. The capillaries in the blood-brain barrier are connected by many tight junctions. The cells here are connected. Generally, capillaries are pretty leaky so that they can leak gases and nutrients into tissue fluid, but that's not the case in the blood-brain barrier. The epithelial cells of the capillaries are bound tightly together. Capillary walls will also have a thick basement membrane. If you remember, that's the connective tissue made of collagen that epithelial cells rest on. So capillary walls will have a thick basement membrane that restricts the passage of blood into the brain. Thus, the materials that will go into the brain are very selected for, and the astrocytes will absorb these materials before sending them to the neuron. The blood-brain barrier regulates which substances enter the brain. It helps prevent neuron exposure to harmful substances such as drugs, wastes, and abnormal solute concentrations. However, lipid-soluble substances can pass and affect the brain. For example, alcohol, nicotine, anesthetics, heavy metals, drugs such as cocaine and methamphetamines. The blood-brain barrier is reduced in certain locations. The choroid plexus needs to produce cerebrospinal fluid, which is a filtrate of the blood, and thus the blood-brain barrier will be reduced there. The hypothalamus maintains homeostasis by monitoring blood chemistry, and the pineal gland secretes melatonin into the bloodstream. So all of these areas will have a reduced blood-brain barrier. A weakening of an arterial vessel wall, called an aneurysm, results in a balloon-like structure that is at risk of bursting under pressure. This often occurs in the brain, aorta, legs, and spleen. Unfortunately, there were usually no symptoms until the aneurysm has burst. A burst aneurysm will cause a debilitating stroke and is often fatal. If an aneurysm is suspected, it can be diagnosed through a CT scan or an angiography. Here we see an angiography where a dye has been injected into the blood vessels and then an image has been taken. And this balloon is the aneurysm, and this is in the brain. Treatment for this requires surgery to remove the aneurysm and go in and seal off the blood vessel. A stroke occurs when blood supply to the brain is reduced through blood vessel blockage or rupture. There are two kinds of strokes, an ischemic stroke and a hemorrhagic stroke. In an ischemic stroke, this is the most common kind, and it is caused by blockage by thrombosis or embolism. A TIA is a transient ischemic attack, and it is a temporary blockage. These may be called mini strokes. However, they may indicate that the patient is at risk for developing the more severe hemorrhagic stroke. A hemorrhagic stroke is caused by blood vessel rupture. Risk factors include high blood pressure, an aneurysm, or an overtreatment of blood thinners. Also a history of TIAs. It's important to know the signs of a stroke. Being able to identify key stroke symptoms allows one to be treated as soon as possible, ideally in under 90 minutes. So remember, be fast. B is for balance. Is the person unsteady on his feet? Eyes. Has the person lost vision in one or both eyes? Face. Does the person's face look uneven? Arms. Is one arm hanging limp? Speech. Are you having trouble speaking? Time. Call 911 if the patient has experienced any of the above. Or you. Now we're going to explore the 4 regions of the adult brain in more detail, starting with the cerebrum. The cerebrum accounts for 80% of the brain's mass. It is the location of conscious thought and the origin of all complex intellectual functions. The longitudinal fissure divides the cerebrum into right and left halves. The corpus callosum is the white matter tissue that connects the two halves. The cerebral cortex makes up 40% of the brain's mass. It is composed of 1.5 to 5 millimeter thick superficial layer of gray matter tissue folded into gyri, sulci, and fissures. It is the center of conscious sensory perception and the initiation of voluntary motor control. This illustration shows neurons of the cerebral cortex. Recall that these are interneurons. And with this being gray matter tissue, these will be the cell bodies, the dendrites, and unmyelinated axons. Three categories of functional areas are involved in specific tasks in the cerebrum. Sensory areas receive somatic sensory input. Association areas integrate new sensory inputs with memories of past experiences. Motor areas send motor output to skeletal muscles. This is the three tenets of the functions of the nervous system: sensory input, integration, and motor output. Sensory input and motor output is generally contralateral, meaning that one side of the brain controls the opposite side of the body, and sensory information comes from one side of the body to the opposite side of the brain. During embryological development, crossing over of central nervous system tracts occurs as the embryo twists along its axis. In this illustration, figure A shows an embryo during the first few moments of development. Generally, an embryo will lay on its left side, and this causes migration of cells from the right side of the embryo towards the left. And at the same time, cells from the right side are moving underneath towards the right. Figure C shows this crossing over and axial twist concluding. And now the right eye has twisted to where the left side of the body is, and the left eye has moved underneath the embryo and is now on the right side. And there is a decussation of tracts called the optic chiasm for the eyeballs that has occurred as a result. And we'll see this in other areas as well as we explore the brain. Sensory input from one side of the body is perceived by the opposite side of the brain. The sense of smell is an exception. It is ipsilateral. It is processed on the same side. So your right nostril will send information to the right side of your brain. Motor output from one side of the brain controls the opposite side of the body. I'm sorry, I have an insane dog. You keep hearing all the commotion. He will be forever immortalized on YouTube. I'm so sorry. This illustration shows sensory impulse pathways and the crossing over that is occurring from the skin on one side of the body up to the sensory areas of the brain on the opposite side. And then, as mentioned, here is the optic chiasm where the neurons cross from the eyes. So that's sensory input. And then with motor output, this is the primary motor cortex sending information down to the medulla oblongata where it crosses over. So this is another decussation or crossing. So sensory input and motor output are generally contralateral due to the axial twist of the embryo during development. There are 5 cerebral lobes that are anatomically distinct from each other and have specific functions: the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, occipital lobe, and insula. The frontal lobe initiates voluntary control of skeletal muscles, eye movement, and speech. The parietal lobe integrates touch, temperature, and proprioception, which is balance. The temporal lobe integrates hearing and smell. The occipital lobe integrates vision, and the insula integrates taste and social preferences. So remember, the process of integration is receiving sensory information and processing it, and then deciding on a motor output. And the frontal lobe is then going to be responsible for carrying out that motor output, as long as it's voluntary to the skeletal muscles. The brainstem is going to be very important in autonomic motor movement, which is involuntary. Although functional areas are localized, the cortex works as a whole to integrate the entire experience. This illustration shows the frontal lobe, which initiates voluntary skeletal muscle movements, eye movements, and speech. The parietal lobe, which receives input from and integrates touch, temperature, and proprioception or balance. The occipital lobe, which integrates visual information. The temporal lobe, which integrates hearing. This is hearing, and interior is smell. And then the insula is deep to the other lobes and integrates taste and social preferences. Motor areas of the cortex are found in the frontal lobes and control voluntary movement. The primary motor cortex controls voluntary skeletal muscle activity. The premotor cortex is the association area for the primary motor cortex. It coordinates learned, skilled motor activities and stores muscle memory. So there are many association areas within the cerebrum, and they're all involved in storing memories, so that when the primary cortex, which is the area that actually receives sensory input or sends out motor output, it can be facilitated by the memories, and the information processing can occur much quicker. It's also called learning, right? It can coordinate learned, skilled motor activities and stores muscle memory. The primary motor cortex has a motor homunculus, which is a map which diagrams the innervation of various body parts. Here we can see a lot of the motor cortex is involved with the face and the hands. This reflects the importance of facial expression and the dexterity, or the ability to perform very fine movements with our hands. This video simulates the motor cortex with transmagnetic stimulation. It has sound, so I won't play it, but the link is active. There are other motor areas found in the frontal lobe. The Broca's area is the motor speech area. It regulates breathing and controlling muscular movements for vocalization. It is usually located on the left hemisphere. The frontal eye field controls skeletal muscle movement of the eyes. So these are all voluntary movements in the frontal lobe. Voluntary skeletal muscle movements, voluntary speech movements, and voluntary eye movements. This illustration shows the motor areas of the cerebral cortex. The primary motor cortex actually moves the skeletal muscles. It sends the impulses down the motor neurons to the individual skeletal muscles. The premotor cortex is the association area that stores muscle memory. I have a picture of someone riding a bike. You've heard the phrase, you don't forget to ride or how to ride a bike. And that's because of your muscle memory. The frontal eye field voluntarily moves the 6 skeletal muscles that move our eyes. And then Broca's area, outlined by dashes, voluntarily moves the muscles for speech. Sensory areas of the cerebral cortex control conscious awareness of sensation. The somatosensory cortex is located in the parietal lobe, just posterior to the primary motor cortex. So since this is the primary area, this is the area that directly receives sensory information for touch, temperature, pain, and proprioception. Then it has a Somatosensory Association Cortex, which will store the memories of touch, temperature, pain, and proprioception. Therefore, the Somatosensory Association Cortex recognizes objects through touch. So you can feel through your school bag for a pen, and you can find the exact pen you're looking for because you have memory stored in the Somatosensory Association Cortex of what that pen feels like. The primary somatosensory cortex also has a sensory homunculus, which is a map that diagrams the innervation of various body parts. Here we can see that the majority of the sensations are concentrated, again, in the face and the hands. And then we also have the feet that are pretty sensitive because of walking around. And then there is a video for stimulating the somatosensory cortex as well, and that link is active in your PowerPoint. Here are some more sensory areas of the cerebral cortex. The visual cortex is located in the occipital lobe, and it is responsible for vision. And notice it has a visual association area. This is the area which will store the memories of the objects you have seen and of colors, etc. The auditory cortex is located in the temporal lobe, and it will process hearing. The auditory association area will contain memories of the sounds that you have heard. So we could call this the primary visual cortex because it directly receives the information for vision. And we can call this the primary auditory cortex because this directly receives information for sound. The primary is the one that is directly initiating motor movements or receiving the sensory input. And the association areas are the areas with the memories. The last two sensory areas of the cerebral cortex include the olfactory cortex located in the temporal lobe. And we can see it, it's a little blurry. So there will be a primary olfactory cortex which directly receives the smell, and the association area that will have the memories of the smell. The association area for the olfactory cortex is located within the limbic system. The limbic system is our emotional brain, and thus the smell will elicit strong memories and emotions. The limbic system also has the structure called the hippocampus, which is involved in storing long-term memories. So smells are very powerful in bringing up memories and emotions. And then we have the gustatory cortex located in the insula. So the primary gustatory cortex will receive the taste sensation, and then the association area will have the memories of that taste. The insula will also perceive your sense of self, your ability to empathize or put yourself in another's shoes, and your social emotions. So it's like your social area of the brain, your preferences for food and beverage, as well as your sense of self, your ability to empathize, and your ability to perceive social emotions and your social grace. So don't forget, the primary cortices are where the information is directly sent to or sent from, for like the motor. And then the association cortices are where the memories are stored. And so between both primary and association cortices, integration can occur. This illustration shows the sensory areas of the cerebral cortex. So here's the primary somatosensory cortex, which processes sensations from the skin and the skeletal muscles. This is the Somatosensory Association Cortex that interprets those sensations and remembers them. The primary visual cortex senses information from the retina, and the visual association area interprets the visual information and remembers it. The auditory association area, let's do the primary first. Primary auditory cortex senses sound waves, and the auditory association area interprets the sound waves and remembers it. And the gustatory cortex in the insula will sense and determine the preferences for taste. Here is the primary olfactory cortex, which will sense smell. The association area is near the limbic system, which may explain why smell elicits memories and emotions. So this is your limbic system right in here. Part of the cingulate gyrus is in the limbic system. There's your parahippocampal gyrus, so the hippocampus would be right here, which is where long-term memories are stored. Memories triggered by smells are the most vivid because the brain's smell and memory centers are directly linked. Memories from other senses are processed by the thalamus before heading to the memory or the brain's memory center. I like this illustration as well because it shows the interior of the primary visual cortex and the visual association areas. So it is much larger than what it appears on the outer surface of the brain. Sight is our predominant sensation. 70% of our sensory neurons are devoted strictly to vision. A functional brain region is a multi-modal association area. This is often abbreviated MMA, like multi-martial arts. But it's a multi-modal association area, MMA. The multimodal association areas integrate information from multiple lobes. They are responsible for higher order thinking, logic, reasoning, language, memory, and pattern recognition. MMAs include the anterior association area, also known as the prefrontal cortex, and the posterior association area. The anterior association area is known as the prefrontal cortex and is associated with higher intellectual functions such as complex thought, judgment, expression of personality, planning future behaviors, and decision making. The prefrontal cortex also evaluates potential consequences of one's actions and modulates one's behavior according to societal norms. The prefrontal cortex contains your working memory and is necessary for the production of abstract ideas, judgment, reasoning, persistence, and planning. So basically, you live in your prefrontal cortex, who you are. This illustration shows the prefrontal cortex. So it's here in front of the motor areas of the frontal lobe. That's why it's called the prefrontal cortex. And it's in light pink. Beautiful. Here's the area for working memory for spatial tasks. Here's the area for the executive area for task management. Here's the area for working memory for object recall tasks, like so where is something sitting? Can you remember where you put it and put it back where you found it? This is the area for solving complex multitask problems. Looking inside, we see the area that processes emotions related to personal and social interactions. So notice we're getting near the insula here, as well as the limbic system. And then this is the orbitofrontal cortex involved in decision making. Again, near the limbic system. So sometimes our emotions and our logic can be muddled. So it's important to step back and take a few breaths if you're feeling overly emotional. Therefore, you can engage your prefrontal cortex and your logic, and you can override any emotions that may cause you to act out rashly. Let's look at the case of Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage was a foreman on a railroad in the 1800s, and a tamping iron was blown through his skull, and it resulted in a left frontal brain injury. He had excellent physical recovery. However, he had a dramatic personality change. He was no longer Gage. He was stubborn, whereas before he was very kind and diplomatic. After the injury, Gage lacked consideration for others, had profane speech, whereas before he was a very gentlemanly personality. And after the injury, he failed to execute his plans, whereas before he was very good at following through. So this was the first case, because Phineas Gage survived the accident, this was the first case in medical records that documented the role of the prefrontal cortex in personality. This illustration shows a growing up brain. Scientists have long thought that the human brain was formed in early childhood, but by scanning children's brains with an MRI year after year, they discovered that the brain undergoes radical changes in adolescence. Excess gray matter is pruned out, making brain connections more specialized and efficient. The parts of the brain that control physical movement, vision, and the senses mature first, while the regions in the front that control higher thinking don't finish the pruning process until the early 20s. And so this is a reason why we always say kids are like sponges. They are. They're absorbing everything in their environment as they're growing and learning and developing. But you can't keep all that information in your brain. You can't continue to absorb everything at that rate. Eventually, you have to prune the information to what is very necessary for your survival in your surroundings. You can continue to learn throughout your life. However, pruning is what makes up the bulk of the brain's computing power. So as the brain matures, it becomes less dense. You're not becoming stupid. You're just becoming more specialized. And so that explains the difference between kids and adults. Dad, you don't know anything. Oh, yes, you do. You've just pruned the most relevant information by that point. Last thing I'll say before moving on is during this process of pruning, children and adolescents are greater risk takers because they're having to go to the school of hard knocks, if you would, and learn consequences. That's part of the pruning. The posterior association area is where somatosensory, visual, and auditory areas join. The posterior association area binds these different sensory inputs into a coherent whole. It helps localize ourselves within our surroundings and navigate effectively. It aids in recognizing patterns and faces, and it contains Wernicke's area, which allows for understanding written and spoken language. The posterior association area is right smack in the center of all of these sensory cortices that we just discussed. This image shows a computer's visualization and recognition of specific objects in the environment. It's pretty basic, but kind of cool that, a person, traffic light. This is how the cameras that we all have on our houses now work. The human brain can take this way further. We can identify specifics about people and cars. We can hear the sounds of the city. We can feel the air around us. We can smell the city, and this helps us to localize where we are in our environment and us to recognize that we are indeed in a city versus another type of landscape. Cerebral white matter lies deep to the cerebral cortex. It is composed of myelinated axons grouped into tracts. Association tracts connect regions of cerebral cortex within the same hemisphere. Commissural tracts connect regions in different hemispheres and includes the corpus callosum. Split brain can occur when the hemispheres cannot communicate. Lastly, projection tracts link cerebral cortex to inferior brain regions and the spinal cord. This illustration shows the association tracts that are connecting different areas of the same hemisphere. This is how sensory information can integrate in the posterior association area. This is how sensory information can reach the motor cortices so that the appropriate skeletal muscles are activated as a result of the sensory information that has incoming. The prefrontal cortex is privy to all of this information being processed, and this is going to help us determine our feelings about it and our judgments and abstract ideas. So that's what the association fibers are doing. And then this is the commissural fibers of the corpus callosum that are connecting the two hemispheres of the brain together. Because remember, there's contralateral information coming from the right side and the left sides of our bodies, so we need to be able to integrate that as a whole unit. Isn't the brain fascinating? The projection fibers will be running from the spinal cord and the brainstem and radiating out through the cerebral cortex. We don't see those in this illustration, but we see them here in green. And again, it shows that decussation, that crossing over that has occurred during our embryonic development. Cerebral lateralization refers to two sides of the cerebrum exhibiting differences in higher order function. So this is your left brain, right brain, personality stuff that you love to hear about. So the left hemisphere is specialized for writing, speech and comprehension, and mathematical analysis. The left hemisphere generally contains Broca's area and Wernicke's area. Broca's area is for motor speech. If you recall, it's in the frontal lobe. And Wernicke's area is for recognizing language and is in the posterior association cortex. The right hemisphere is specialized in visuospatial relationships, imagination, and the comparison of your senses that you are experiencing. Lateralization is correlated with handedness. In right-handed people, the left hemisphere contains speech, comprehension, and math centers. Left-handed people may have these centers on either hemispheres, but most will still have them on the left. So the left hemisphere is generally the one that will be specialized for writing, speech, and comprehension, and mathematic analysis. However, in a left-handed person, that may be lateralized to the right side. Kind of fun. So here's the lateralization in illustration format. The left hemisphere for speech, right hand motor control, feeling shapes with right hand, superior language and mathematical comprehension. And then the right hemisphere is memory for shapes, limited language comprehension, feeling shapes with left hand, musical ability, recognition of faces, and spatial relationships. There are anatomical asymmetries called pitalias, which is a protrusion of a lobe on one side of the brain compared to the other. Right-handed individuals tend to have right frontal pitalias and left occipital pitalias. Left-handed individuals will show the opposite. They will have left frontal pitalias and right occipital pitalias. The cerebrum contains gray matter nuclei deep within the hemispheres. These augment cortical processes, meaning that they aid in the cortical processes, particularly motor control. So the basal ganglia nuclei will coordinate muscle movements. Under normal conditions, the basal ganglia nuclei do not initiate particular movements. However, once movement is underway, the basal ganglia nuclei provide general pattern and rhythm to the trunk and limb muscles. Parkinson's disease is associated with a loss of basal ganglia nuclei. We will discuss Parkinson's disease in a few slides. Here are the basal ganglia nuclei. The reason that I include all three terms is that the basal ganglia is what they were called for many, many years, but we know that the centers of gray matter deep in the brain are called nuclei. Therefore, the basal ganglia have been renamed basal nuclei, but you will still see basal ganglia in a lot of the literature. So let's just use all the words. Basal ganglia nuclei. So these are a group of nuclei that act as a cohesive functional unit, and they cooperate with the cerebral cortex in controlling movement. So your primary motor cortex of the frontal lobe will be located right here, and the primary motor cortex is what initiates the control for voluntary skeletal muscle movement. Once control has been initiated, the basal ganglia nuclei will help to coordinate and smooth the motions of your skeletal muscles. They are separate from the basal forebrain nuclei, which are related to arousal, learning, memory, and motor control. The basal forebrain nuclei are right around in here, and they help to radiate information through the association fibers. Epileptic seizures occur when a torrent of electrical discharges are generated in groups of brain neurons. Absent seizures are mild forms, and they are indicated by the expression going blank for a few seconds. In a tonic-clonic or grand mal seizure, this is the most severe type. A person loses consciousness, and this can last for a few minutes. This can be very dangerous because as the person is seizing, their body is heating up, and this can lead to brain damage as the brain heats up as well. Epilepsy is often genetically induced, but also frequently caused by head trauma, stroke, infection, and tumor. It can be treated with anti-seizure medications, and surgery may be necessary in severe cases. This is an MRI showing the ictal stage of a seizure, which is the active stage, versus the interictal, when a seizure is not occurring. These show electroencephalograms, or EEGs, of brainwave activity. The normal EEG is shown in the top left. An absent seizure is shown in the bottom left versus the tonic-clonic seizure on the right. It's an electrical storm. Alzheimer's disease is a progressive degenerative disease of the brain that results in dementia. Symptoms include memory loss, shortened attention span, disorientation, mood swings, and eventual language loss. Examinations of brain tissue reveal aggregations of amyloid plaques composed of beta amyloid proteins, neuron fragments, and microglial cells. Neurofibrillary tangles formed from deformed tau proteins are found inside neurons. The brain shrinks as the amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles cause brain cells to die. The basal forebrain and the hippocampus are particularly affected. These are important in thinking and memory. Thus, their loss leads to loss of higher intellectual functions and memory. A loss of cells in the basal forebrain is linked with a loss of acetylcholine. In the brain, acetylcholine is responsible for maintaining conscious awareness. Drugs that inhibit the breakdown of acetylcholine and the basal forebrain can potentially enhance cognitive function of Alzheimer's disease patients. This illustration shows a healthy brain with a normal MRI, PET scan. This is the metabolic scan here. That's what a PET or PET scan shows, metabolic activity. So here we see the normal metabolic activity and then the illustration of the healthy brain. In mild Alzheimer's disease, we see cortical shrinking, moderately enlarged ventricles, and a shrinking hippocampus. And that is illustrated here in the PET scan as well. In severe Alzheimer's disease, there is severe cortical shrinkage, severely enlarged ventricles, and severe shrinking of the hippocampus, as is illustrated here in the PET scan. The central illustration shows the healthy neuron with the healthy axons, healthy tau proteins, and then in the diseased neuron, we have disintegrating microtubules, and we have amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles forming as the deformed tau proteins are accumulating inside the neuron. A loss of consciousness occurs when an individual is no longer aware of themselves or their surroundings. Fainting, also called syncope, is a brief loss of consciousness and indicates inadequate cerebral blood flow due to low blood pressure, hemorrhage, or sudden emotional stress. Coma is a total unresponsiveness to sensory stimuli for an extended period of time. It may be induced by blows to the head due to cerebral or brainstem trauma, tumors or infections that invade the brainstem, or metabolic disorders such as hypoglycemia, drug overdose, liver or kidney failure. Here are PET scans showing the states of consciousness. On the right is a fully conscious individual with lots of metabolic activity in their brain. In a minimally conscious state, we see a lower level of brain activity, and then in the vegetative state is minimal brain activity with no consciousness whatsoever. And then, of course, brain death may occur shortly after that. Now let's move to the second major region of the adult brain. That was just the first major region, but obviously that's the largest region. 80% of the brain is the cerebrum, so we've just done 80% of the work. So let's go. The diencephalon is located in the center of the brain and includes three areas: the epithalamus, also called the pineal gland, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus. Dia means through, and encephalo means the brain. So this is going right through the brain. So here we have the thalamus. Everything goes through the thalamus sensory-wise except for the sense of smell. There we go, through the brain. And the hypothalamus is going to be the control center for the autonomic nervous system. And so it's going to basically control involuntary actions. And then it's connected to our pituitary gland, which is the master endocrine gland. And then here's our pineal gland name because it looks like a pine cone, and that secretes melatonin. All right, let's start with the epithalamus. The epithalamus is located above the thalamus. Epi's above the thalamus. It contains the pineal gland, which secretes melatonin. Melatonin is important in the regulation of day-night cycles and also in the regulation of reproductive functions. Higher levels of melatonin increase reproductive potential in females. Melatonin is the darkness hormone secreted at night as we sleep. It is the chemical messenger that transmits information about light-dark cycles to the brain center that governs the body's biological clock. So here we see melatonin levels are peaking right when your alarm clock is starting to go off in the morning, right? That's not fair. No wonder it's hard to get up that early. And then they're tanking around mid-morning through the rest of the day so that you are hopefully wide awake and alert. The thalamus is the largest structure in the diencephalon. The thalamus receives sensory input from all senses except smell. The information is filtered so that only the most important information reaches the cerebral cortex. Thalamic nuclei project sensory input to the appropriate areas of the cerebral cortex. I like to think of the thalamus as a sensory operator. When an incoming sensation is coming into the brain, the thalamus directs it to the appropriate area. This illustration is showing the sensory functions of the thalamus. So in step 1, pain, temperature, and coarse touch will cross the midline in the spinal cord. In step 2, fine touch, vibration, and proprioception pathways will cross in the medulla. And in step 3, sensory pathways will synapse in the thalamus. And in step 4, sensations are perceived in the primary somatic sensory cortex. So sensory pathways generally have 3 neurons that are involved. The primary sensory neuron, which is the one that actually is affected directly by the sensation. The secondary sensory neuron, which carries the information from the primary to the thalamus. And then the tertiary neuron, which is going to be synapsing in the thalamus and carrying that sensory information to the appropriate area of the cerebral cortex. The hypothalamus is the big boss of the autonomic nervous system. It maintains homeostasis of the body and is stimulated by sensory information, changes in the composition of cerebrospinal fluid, and chemical stimuli in the blood. Recall that the hypothalamus will have a reduced or even lack a blood-brain barrier. The homeostatic functions of the hypothalamus are numerous, and they include the control of the autonomic nervous system, which influences heart rate, blood pressure, digestive activities, and respiration, control of the endocrine system, which secretes hormones that control activities in the anterior pituitary gland, and the anterior pituitary gland is the big boss of the endocrine system. The hypothalamus itself produces antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. The hypothalamus regulates body temperature. Neurons in the preoptic area of the hypothalamus detect altered temperature and signal other hypothalamic nuclei to heat or cool the body. Oh, my dogs, my dogs. Homeostatic functions of the hypothalamus also include monitoring food intake by monitoring nutrient levels and regulating hunger, monitoring water intake by monitoring concentration of dissolved substances in the blood and regulating thirst, monitoring sleep-wake rhythms in the suprachiasmatic nucleus. It directs the pineal gland to secrete melatonin, regulating circadian rhythms, and it has a role in emotional behavior. As part of the limbic system, the hypothalamus helps to control emotional responses to pleasure, fear, etc. Thus, stress can lead to homeostatic imbalance because the hypothalamus is directly affected, which then directly affects all of these other processes just talked about. Here are the nuclei of the hypothalamus. You don't have to memorize them. This just helps you to visualize the important roles the hypothalamus has. This is the anterior pituitary gland, which is going to secrete at least 12 hormones that are going to go into the body and direct the production of other hormones. So that's why it's the big boss of the endocrine system. The hypothalamus will also secrete its own hormones, the antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin, through the posterior pituitary gland. Here we see the centers for water balance, body temperature, blood pressure, water balance, temperature regulation and shivering, GI tract motility, satiety, which is the sensation of fullness, mammillary body, which initiates the feeding reflexes, and the biological clock, which directs the pineal gland to secrete melatonin. See, I told you it would be quick now that we have gone through the cerebrum. So that was the diencephalon. Let's look at the brainstem. The brainstem contains tracts that controls the flow of information between the brain, cerebellum, and spinal cord. It also controls important nuclei that control autonomic behaviors necessary for survival, such as breathing. Remember earlier I said that the primary motor cortex controls skeletal movement, voluntary skeletal movement, and the brainstem is going to be largely involved with involuntary movement. The brainstem is associated with 10 of the 12 pairs of cranial nerves, and it includes 3 areas: the midbrains, pons, and medulla oblongata. Here is the brainstem, named because it looks like the stem, which would support like a flower, right? Your cerebrum, diencephalon, and cerebellum are the flower. So the brainstem includes the midbrain, which some sources will refer to as its own area of the brain, but it is part of the brainstem, and the pons and the medulla oblongata. So that's your brain stem. And notice that it is connected inferiorly to the spinal cord. The midbrain is the superior region of the brainstem. It has important centers, which include the corpora quadrigemina, which mean 4 bodies. Corpora is body, quadrigemina 4. These are reflex centers for vision and hearing. They include the superior colliculus for visual reflexes and the inferior colliculus for auditory reflexes. The substantia nigra regulates activity of the basal ganglia by secreting dopamine, and this helps to coordinate muscle movements. The midbrain connects to cranial nerves 3 and 4. Cranial nerve 3 is the oculomotor nerve. Cranial nerve 4 is the trochlear nerve. Both of these are eye movers. Here is the thalamus and the pineal gland to orient you. This is the midbrain here, and the superior colliculi for visual reflexes. Colliculi is the plural of colliculus. Each one is a colliculus. And then the inferior colliculi, which are for auditory reflexes. So superior colliculi, visual reflexes. You look at something straight on to believe it. Seeing is believing, right? And always remember that vision is our most important sense. So superior colliculi is a visual reflex for our superior sense. And then the inferior colliculi is the auditory reflexes. So when you hear a loud noise, you're going to jump and be startled generally. And then you're going to look towards that noise. That's the superior colliculi and the inferior colliculi working together. Parkinson's disease results from degeneration of the dopamine-releasing neurons within the substantia nigra of the midbrain. Dopamine-derived basal nuclei become overactive, causing head nodding, pill-rolling movements of the fingers, a forward-bent walking posture and shuffling gait, and a stiff facial expression. Patients are slow in initiating and executing movement. This illustration shows the substantia nigra of the midbrain, and it's diminished in Parkinson's disease. And so the substantia nigra contains melanin, which is why it has this color to it, and the melanin in this case is the precursor for dopamine production. And the dopamine is what goes in and helps the basal ganglia nuclei coordinate skeletal muscle movement. This figure shows the presence of dopamine neurons assessed by 18 fluorodopa positron emission tomography, which is a PET scan. And so in figure A, the PET scan from a control subject showing high uptake of the precursor used to synthesize dopamine. So this is a nice, happy, healthy substantia nigra. In B, this is an example of patient with Parkinson's disease with motor signs mainly confined to the left limbs. Uptake of the dopamine precursor is markedly reduced in the right posterior putamen. It's up to 70% below normal in the area indicated by the arrow. And it says that the motor signs are mainly confined to the left limb. So see how it's the right substantia nigra that is affected? And so it will be the left limbs that are going to show signs of that. They're going to be paralyzed, with limited mobility. Treatment for Parkinson's disease includes the drug L-DOPA, often helps alleviate the symptoms for a time. However, L-DOPA becomes ineffective as more and more neurons die off. Electric therapy and GABA, which is a neurotransmitter, are both effective at quieting the overactive basal nuclei. If I remember, GABA is one of your major inhibitory neurotransmitters in the brain. And medical grade cannabis has been increasing in popularity as an effective treatment. This video has sound, and so the link will be active in your PowerPoint. Pons means bridge. It is a bulging region on the anterior brainstem. So we're moving inferiorly down the brainstem. The pons has important centers that include respiratory centers that regulate breathing, controlling the depth and duration of inhalation and exhalation. The pons also connects to cranial nerves 5, 6, 7, and 8. Here is the pons. It has this kind of belly that's protruding anteriorly, and pons means bridge. So this is bridging the actions of the cerebellum with the cerebrum and the spinal cord, helping the cerebellum and the cerebrum and spinal cord to communicate. And we'll learn that the cerebellum is a major center for balance and equilibrium. So the pons is facilitating that function. Here are the respiratory centers of the pons, the pneumotaxic and anoustic center, which are going to help control the rate and depth of inhalation as well as exhalation. And then it will be connected to cranial nerves 5. Here's cranial nerve 5, 6, 7, and 8. Cranial nerve 5 is your trigeminal nerve. Cranial nerve 6 is your abducens nerve. Cranial nerve 7 is facial. And cranial nerve 8 is vestibulocochlear. We also see this important area called the reticular formation, which we will talk about in a moment. But this is a motor area that contains projection fibers that will largely influence involuntary motor movements in the body. Reflexive centers. The medulla oblongata is the inferior part of the brain stem and is continuous with the spinal cord. All sensory and motor tracts between the brain and spinal cord travel through the medulla oblongata. The large tracts that we have seen in previous slides that decussate or cross over in the medulla are called pyramidal motor tracts. They are very large motor tracts that are, you guessed it, pyramid shaped. Important centers of the medulla oblongata include the cardiac center, regulating heart rate during exercise or stress, respiratory center that controls breathing rate, a vasomotor center that controls blood pressure, and reflex centers for coughing, sneezing, hiccups, swallowing, and salivating. So the medulla oblongata is a very important brainstem area for autonomic control. And it connects to cranial nerves 9, 10, 11, and 12. So the medulla oblongata lies between the pons and the spinal cord, and it contains centers which control key autonomic body functions. It also relays nerve signals between the brain and spinal cord. So here are the important centers again. The respiratory center controls the rate, rhythm, and depth of breathing. The cardiac center regulates heartbeat. The vasomotor center controls blood pressure. And reflex centers exist for vomiting, coughing, sneezing, hiccuping, and swallowing. Okay, so that's the brainstem. Now let's look at the cerebellum. The cerebellum is the second largest structure in the brain. It is Latin for little brain because it resembles the anatomy of the cerebrum. The cerebellum helps to plan movements using information from proprioception, which is that sense of balance that is brought in to the primary somatosensory cortex. The cerebellum also receives inputs from the inner ears and maintains equilibrium and posture. So your inner ears will also contain centers for balance. The cerebellum coordinates fine motor control over skeletal muscles and stores muscle memory. It works with the primary motor cortex, the basal ganglia nuclei, and motor tracts in the brain stem, such as that reticular formation, which we'll look at soon. These illustrations show all of the areas in the brain that are responsible for motor control. We've talked about a lot of them so far. So in figure B, we're looking at the planning stage. When a conscious decision is made to perform a specific movement, information is relayed from the frontal lobes to the motor association areas. These areas in turn relay information to the cerebellum and the basal nuclei. So this is, the cerebellum and the basal nuclei. This is the planning stage. And then in figure C, it's showing movement. As the movement begins, the motor association areas send instructions to the primary motor cortex. So the motor association area is your premotor cortex, and it's sending information to the primary motor cortex. Feedback from the basal nuclei and the cerebellum modifies these commands, and output along the conscious and subconscious pathways directs involuntary adjustments in position and muscle tone. So our conscious and our subconscious go through the medulla. From the primary motor cortex, they will be the pyramidal tracts that will cross in the medulla oblongata. And then we also have the reticular formation. And then there's other nuclei that will be involved. The cerebellum can be damaged by trauma or stroke, tumors, multiple sclerosis, or drugs and alcohol abuse. Issues can also be hereditary. The result is a degenerative condition called ataxia, which is a disturbance in muscular coordination. A means without, and taxis means movement, so without controlled movement. In severe ataxia, the individual cannot sit or stand without assistance. This link has sound, but is active in your PowerPoint. Here we'll look at functional brain systems. Functional brain systems have structures that are not confined to one major region of the brain. They are located throughout two or more regions of the brain. These systems include the limbic system and the reticular formation. The limbic system is the emotional brain and is located within the cerebrum and diencephalon. The reticular formation is a mass of gray matter that projects through the brainstem into the diencephalon and cerebrum. The limbic system processes and experiences emotions. Three important structures include the hippocampus, the amygdala, and the cingulate gyrus. The hippocampus consolidates short-term to long-term memory. The amygdala recognizes and elicits the fear response, and the cingulate gyrus expresses emotions through gestures and aids in resolving mental conflicts when we are frustrated. The limbic system consists of portions of the frontal lobe. Looking here, you see the prefrontal cortex, portions of the temporal lobe, aka the olfactory center, the hypothalamus, the thalamus, basal nuclei, other deep nuclei, and as we've learned, it's associated with the sense of smell. And the functions are to control emotions, produce feelings, interpret sensory impulses, and facilitate memory storage and retrieval, aka learning. So this is where long-term potentiation is going to occur, which is the strengthening of synapses for long-term memory. This is the hippocampus, which is where the long-term memories will be integrated. And I think of hippos as being large animals, and campus is where you're learning, right? So you're learning a large amount of information, and the hippocampus is going to help you to remember that in the long term. This is the cingulate gyrus, where we resolve conflicts through our gestures, or communicate through gestures and resolve mental conflicts. Again, there it is right by the prefrontal cortex. So remember, take a deep breath, count to 3. Don't let your emotions override your logic. And then the amygdala, right here, is the area where the fear response is. In my psychology book, when I was in undergrad, it had a picture of a cat with all of its fur standing up and its tail fluffed out because it was afraid. So the amygdala is where you recognize fear and can be afraid, which of course is a very important survival method. The reticular formation contains loosely organized gray matter within the brainstem, diencephalon, and cerebrum. The reticular activating system, abbreviated RAS, processes sensory information, sends signals to the cerebral cortex to bring about alertness, and causes a return to a conscious state of awareness. Alertness helps bring about awareness of sensations, movements, thoughts, and is necessary for the highest states of consciousness. The reticular activating system maintains alertness as well as focus. It filters information so that the most important senses are registered first. The reticular activating system is depressed by alcohol, sleep-inducing drugs, and tranquilizers. Injury to the system can result in unconsciousness. This illustration shows an experiment on the reticular activating system. When a click is sounded, the electrical activity in the cat's auditory nerve increases markedly. And notice that the cat is looking towards the researcher because it heard that sound. But when a jar of mice is present, the same click causes a much weaker response because the cat is hyper-focused on its prey, and so it's not really focusing on the sound that it is hearing. So this is an illustration of the reticular formation that goes through the brainstem, and notice that there are descending motor projections to the spinal cord. So a lot of involuntary reflexes are going down and activating skeletal muscles as a result of the reticular formation. And then this is the reticular activating system, which is bringing sensory information towards the brain through the spinal cord and brainstem, and then it radiates out through the thalamus into the areas of the cerebral cortex to help maintain alertness or to return you to a state of consciousness if you're asleep. So basically, if everything is normal, like the clothes on your back are where they're supposed to be on your back, all the sounds that you're hearing are like white noise, you're not hearing anything that's too alarming, all your visual cues are normal, smells are normal. But then let's say something changes. For instance, all of a sudden you start to smell something burning. You're hopefully going to wake up if you're asleep, or your fire alarm is going to go off, which will wake you up because it's a loud noise in an otherwise white noise environment. Last thing we'll talk about in this chapter is the cranial nerves. Nerves that connect directly to the brain are called cranial nerves. They are classified as sensory, motor, or mixed, which means they are both sensory and motor. There are 12 pairs of cranial nerves. Pairs 1 and 2 attach to the cerebrum, pairs 3 and 4 attach to the midbrain, pairs 5, 6, 7, and 8 attach to the pons, and pairs 9, 10, 11, and 12 attach to the medulla oblongata. Other than the vagus nerve, or cranial nerve 10, cranial nerves serve only the head and neck. This illustration shows the 12 cranial nerves, and they start from the anterior and move posteriorly. So we have cranial nerve 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, looks like a ladder, and 12. So they're in pairs. So there's 12 pairs. The mnemonic for the name is OOO, to take a family vacation, go Vegas after hours. And this works because as I was taking you through the brainstem and telling you about certain cranial nerves, I was doing the mnemonic in my head to make sure I was talking about the right one. So OOO is cranial nerves 1, 2, and 3. So the first O is olfactory, which is your sense of smell. Cranial nerve number 2 is optic, which is the sense of sight. And cranial nerve number 3 is ocular motor, which is the major mover of your eye muscles. So OOO is the first 3 pairs of cranial nerves. Cranial nerves 1, 2, and 3. Olfactory is number 1, optic is number 2, and ocular motor is number 3. Then we proceed to take a family vacation. To take a family vacation. So that's cranial nerves number 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. So cranial nerve number 4 is the first T, and it's trochlear. And it is going to help move your eye inferolaterally. So basically to look over your shoulder. So that's the trochlear. Trigeminal is number 5. It's a very large nerve, and it branches 3 times. That's what tri. And it is an important sensory nerve, the sensations of touch, temperature, and pain in your face. And it also is motor. It moves your chewing muscles when you eat and talk. La la la. Abducens is number 6. This is an eye mover. Helps you to look laterally, so to the side. It's number 6. Number 7 is the facial. It's a little paired nerve here. Notice that the trigeminal is big enough that it's got 2 trunks coming from it. So does the facial. It's got 2 trunks. And this is the other cranial nerve that really branches in your face. It branches 5 times. It's cranial nerve 7, and it branches 5 times. And it is the one that helps you to taste. And it also is important in facial expressions, hence its name, the facial nerve. And then cranial nerve pair number 8 is the vestibulocochlear nerve. Vestibulo means the vestibule of the ear, so this is important for equilibrium and balance. And then cochlear is your inner ear for hearing. So that's to take a family vacation. So 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Trochlear, trigeminal, abducens, facial, vestibulocochlear. Now we're going to go Vegas after hours. So that's cranial nerves 9, 10, 11, and 12. Go is for the glossopharyngeal nerve. Glosso means tongue, and pharyngeal means throat. So this is an important cranial nerve for swallowing as well as taste. Cranial nerve number 10 is the vagus nerve, and it is called the vagus nerve because it is a vagabond or a wanderer. It is the cranial nerve that leaves the head and neck area and goes to service all the major organs of your body. It's very important in maintaining homeostasis and autonomic control. The accessory nerve is cranial nerve number 11. It looks like a ladder, and this is a motor nerve that helps you to move your neck and shoulders. I think of accessories as being like your necklaces and scarves, and you wear those on your neck. And then cranial nerve number 12 is your hypoglossal nerve, which is under the tongue and helps regulate tongue movements. So again, that's 9, 10, 11, and 12. So there's a mnemonic for the sensory, motor, or both, sensory and motor, and it is some say marry money, but my brother says big brains matter more. So starting from cranial nerve number 1, we go some say marry money, but my brother says big brains matter more. So here's a slide for you to practice on. And then the rest of these slides take you through the individual cranial nerves and what their functions are. So cranial nerve number 1 is the olfactory nerve, and its function is purely sensory, and it carries the afferent impulses for the sense of smell towards the temporal lobe. Homeostatic imbalance of the olfactory nerve occurs from a fracture of the ethmoid bone or lesions of olfactory fibers, and this can result in a partial or total loss of smell. This condition is known as anosmia, and this can also affect your sense of taste. Cranial nerve number 2 is your optic nerve. Their function is purely sensory, and they carry afferent impulses for vision. And so here they cross at the optic chiasm. This is a beautiful picture showing them going through the thalamus before being sent to the visual cortex, the primary visual cortex. Damage to the optic nerve will result in blindness in the eye served by that particular nerve. Damage to the visual pathway beyond the optic chiasm results in partial visual losses, and visual defects are called anopsias. Cranial nerve number 3 is the oculomotor nerve, and this one is a motor nerve, and it is the main eye mover. So it is what allows us to look up, down, and across our eyes. So in oculomotor nerve paralysis, the eye cannot be moved up, down, or inward. At rest, the eye will rotate laterally, which is called external strabismus, because the actions of the extrinsic eye muscles not served by the cranial nerves are unopposed. The upper eyelid will droop, called ptosis, and the person has double vision, called diplopia, and trouble focusing on close objects. Cranial nerve number 4 is the trochlear nerve, and its function is motor, and it helps to move the eye inferolaterally, so looking over your shoulder. This is the trochlea that is connected to the superior oblique muscle, which is served by the trochlear nerve. Cranial nerve 4. Cranial nerve 5 is the trigeminal nerve. This one is both sensory and motor. It has 3 major divisions, hence trigeminal. So trigeminal is the largest cranial nerves. The fiber extends from the pons to the face and forms the 3 divisions: the ophthalmic, which services your forehead and eyes, maxillary, which is upper jaw, and mandibular, which is lower jaw. As the main general sensory nerves of the face, it transmits afferent impulses from touch, temperature, and pain receptors. Cell bodies of sensory neurons of all 3 divisions are located in the large trigeminal ganglion. The mandibular division also contains motor fibers that innervate chewing muscles. Dentists desensitize upper and lower jaws by injecting local anesthetics such as Novocaine into alveolar branches of the maxillary and mandibular divisions, respectively. Since this blocks pain-transmitting fibers of teeth, the surrounding tissue becomes numb. Here we see the trigeminal ganglion that is going to innervate or synapse with the sensory neurons coming from the ophthalmic division in the forehead, the mandibular and the maxillary division in the upper jaw, and the mandibular division in the lower jaw. And the mandibular division also contains motor neurons that innervate muscles for chewing. Homeostatic imbalance is called trigeminal neuralgia, and it is caused by the inflammation of the trigeminal nerve and is widely considered to produce the most excruciating pain known. The stabbing pain lasts for a few seconds to a minute, but it can be relentless, occurring 100 times a day, usually provoked by some sensory stimulus such as brushing the teeth or even passing breeze hitting the face. Thought to be caused by a loop of artery or vein that compresses the trigeminal nerve near its exit from the brainstem. Analgesics and and anticonvulsant are only partially effective. In severe cases, surgery relieves the agony, either by moving the compressing vessel or by destroying the nerve. Nerve destruction results in the loss of sensation on that side of the face. My sister had trigeminal neuralgia from compression in her sinuses, and she opted to have the surgery where they went in and removed the cyst that was growing in her sinus and compressing on the trigeminal nerve. So they literally had to cut her nose off and lift the flap of her nose up and go in to her sinuses and scrape all that stuff out. But it was worth it because it relieved her trigeminal neuralgia. Cranial nerve 6 is the abducens nerve. This is a motor nerve that supplies the motor fibers to the lateral rectus muscle that moves the eye laterally to look to the side. And so the homeostatic imbalance is in abducens nerve paralysis, the eye cannot be moved laterally. At rest, the eyeball will rotate medially, called internal strabismus. Cranial nerve 7 is the facial nerves. These branch 5 times, and they are mixed nerve, sensory and motor. They are the chief motor nerves of facial movements, and they will also convey sensory impulses from the taste buds of the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. So the 2/3 of the tongue that the facial nerve innervates will help you taste sugar, salty, sour, bitter. In the homeostatic imbalance of the facial nerve, Bell's palsy is characterized by the paralysis of facial muscles on the affective side and partial loss of taste sensation. It may develop rapidly, often overnight. It is caused by inflamed and swollen facial nerve, possibly due to the herpes simplex 1 viral infection, the one that causes cold sores. The lower eyelid will droop, the corner of the mouth will sag, making it difficult to eat or speak normally. Tears will drip continuously from the eye, and the eye cannot be completely closed, causing dry eye. It's treated with corticosteroids, and recovery is completed in 70% of the cases. However, symptoms can persist for several years. So you might wake up thinking you had a stroke, but you may have had Bell's palsy. So here are the branches of the facial nerve: the temporal branch, zygomatic, buccal, mandibular, and cervical. And so here's showing the sensory input from the taste buds, and then each of these are glands. When a cranial nerve innervates a gland, that is a motor function. So for the salivary glands, it will cause the secretion of saliva. And for the lacrimal gland, it will cause secretion of tears. Cranial nerve number 8 is the vestibulocochlear nerves, and the function is sensory. The vestibular branch transmits afferent impulses for the sense of equilibrium. The cochlear branch transmits afferent impulses for the sense of hearing. In a homeostatic imbalance, lesions of the cochlear nerve or cochlear receptors results in central or nerve deafness. Damage to vestibular division produces dizziness, rapid involuntary eye movements, loss of balance, nausea, and vomiting. This is known as vertigo. High-frequency hearing loss is very common and occurs when the nerve fibers are damaged for the cochlear nerve. So this is the vestibular part. Vestibule means foyer or entryway, and this is equilibrium and balance. And then the cochlea means snail. See how this is a snail shape? And this is your hearing. Cranial nerve 9 is the glossopharyngeal nerves. These are mixed nerves that innervate part of the tongue and pharynx and are very important in the motor function of swallowing. You can see that they're also innervating a large salivary gland, the parotid gland, and thus will stimulate salivary flow. Sensory fibers will conduct taste and general sense of the pharynx and posterior tongue. Homeostatic imbalance, an injured or inflamed glossopharyngeal nerve can impair swallowing and taste. Cranial nerve 10 is the vagus nerves, and these are mixed nerves. Nearly all motor fibers are parasympathetic efferents, except those that serve skeletal muscles of the pharynx and larynx that are involved in swallowing. Parasympathetic motor fibers supply the heart, lungs, and abdominal viscera and are involved in regulating heart rate, breathing, and digestive system activity. They transmit sensory impulses from the thoracic and abdominal viscera, from the aortic arch baroreceptors for blood pressure, and the carotid and aortic bodies for respiration. They also have taste buds on the epiglottis and carry proprioceptor fibers from the muscles of the larynx and pharynx. So basically, they innervate the organs in the body for both sensory and motor functions. The homeostatic imbalances, since laryngeal branches of the vagus innervate nearly all muscles of the larynx or voice box, vagal nerve paralysis will lead to hoarseness or loss of voice. Other symptoms are difficulty swallowing and impaired digestive system motility. These parasympathetic nerves are important for maintaining the normal state of visceral organ activity. Without their influence, the sympathetic nerves, which mobilize and accelerate vital body processes and shut down digestion, would dominate, and this is incompatible with life. Accessory nerve is cranial nerve 11, and its function is primarily motor in function and supplies motor fibers to the trapezius and the sternocleidomastoid muscles. The trapezius and the sternocleidomastoid together help move your head and neck. Injury to one accessory nerve causes the head to turn towards the injury side as a result of sternocleidomastoid muscle paralysis. Shrugging that shoulder, which is the role of the trapezius muscle, will become difficult. And then finally, cranial nerve number 12 is the hypoglossal nerve. This is primarily motor in function and carries somatic motor fibers to the intrinsic and extrinsic muscles of the tongue. And this allows tongue movements that mix and manipulate food during chewing and contribute to swallowing and speech. Damage to the hypoglossal nerve causes difficulty in speech and swallowing. If both nerves are impaired, the person cannot protrude the tongue. If only one side is affected, the tongue deviates or points towards the affected side. Eventually, the paralyzed side will begin to atrophy. My brain is like the Bermuda Triangle. Information goes in and then it's never found again. I bet you're feeling that way after this lecture. I won't lie, me too. Well, thank you for listening and have a blessed day. Good luck with the studying.